Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the second of our series of webinars on Judaism and the Laws of War with Rabbi Kimelman, hosted by the Union for Traditional Judaism and co-sponsored by the Kaplan JCC on the Palisades. Please note that this program is being recorded. Also, everyone is muted, but we welcome questions and comments in the chat, and we'll do our best to address them at the end of the presentation. My name is Noah Gradovsky, and I'm a board member of UTJ. Before we begin, a few remarks and notes. Thank you to everyone who sponsored this webinar series. We mentioned their names in the last webinar, and we included their names in emails, and I've also put them into the chat, and we'll save time by not reading the names over again. I'd also like to thank everyone who made a donation along with registering for this program. For those of you who are new to UTJ, let me add a few words of introduction about our organization. The Union for Traditional Judaism is a group of rabbis, scholars, and lay people who advocate for a passionate, open-minded approach to Torah study and observance of Jewish law, halakha, rooted in classical religious sources and informed by modern scholarship. Our philosophy is distinguished by the symbiotic relationship between faith in the God-given Torah and intellectual integrity, and our emphasis on the sacred framework of halakha as our unifying guide. We are also pleased to be co-sponsoring this program with the Kaplan JCC. The Kaplan JCC on the Palisades is a welcoming home away from home for all who pass through its front doors. Their 185,000 square foot building plus acres of outside grounds feature 2 fitness centers, an indoor and outdoor aquatic center, group exercise, spin and Pilates, studios, 2 gymnasiums, tennis and racket courts, indoor track, and a luxurious spa, multiple playgrounds and fields, and so much more. The JCC is home to the renowned Tharner School of Music, Leonard and Cyril Reuven Early Childhood Center, Neil Klatskin Summer Camp, and the JCC Dance and Drama School. The JCC is also proud to offer extensive, high-quality programs and services to adults of all ages, as well as seniors and individuals with special needs. Learn more at www.jccotp.org, and I will put that link into the chat. There we go. With that, let me introduce our speaker. Reuven Kimelman is a professor of classical Judaica at Brandeis University and rabbi of Beth Abraham Sephardic Congregation in New England. He is also scholar in residence at the Kaplan JCC on the Palisades. He specializes in the history of classical Judaism with a focus on the history and poetics of Jewish liturgy. His latest study is titled The Rhetoric of Jewish Prayer, a historical and literary commentary on the Daily Prayer Book. His other book is The Mystical Meaning of Lecha Dodi and Kabbalat Shabbat. Professor Kimelman's other writings focus on the interaction between Judaism and Christianity, on the ethics of war, and on his mentor, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. With that, I am going to put the source sheet into the chat, and I am going to share my screen while we turn over the presentation to Rabbi Kimelman.
Okay, welcome to our second session on Judaism and the ethics of war. This time there'll be a source sheet in Hebrew with some translation, and I will go through the relevant parts together with you. I want to summarize what we did in the first session before we move on to the second session. In the first session, we emphasized there are 2 types of wars in halachic literature. One is called Milchemet Mitzvah and Milchemet Reshut, which I translated. Milchemet Mitzvah means in conducting the war, one is performing a mitzvah, not that it's a mitzvah to go to war. And Milchemet Reshut means Bereshut Beit Din. It has the approval of the Sanhedrin, whose job is to represent the people. Milchemet Reshut does not mean an optional war. It means Bereshut Beit Din, authorized by the court, not by the executive. We mentioned there were 3 mandatory wars against the original nations of Canaan, which no longer exist, against the people of Amalek, which according to some sources follows that of Canaan, and the only remaining war is a defensive war. A defensive war is defined in 2 ways. One is that the enemy is already attacked, or one is that the enemy is about to attack and is on the border and is the means for attack. And we discussed the distinction between that last session. In any case, war is declared by the executive at the discretion of the Sanhedrin or its judicial legislative equivalent. This is mentioned in Mishnah Sanhedrin 2:4. And the declaration to go to war must have been preceded by overtures of peace. And other resorts must have been tried before one goes to war. There also has to be a good chance of success. That is not a holy war. There is such category as holy war in Judaism. The phrase does not exist in Hebrew, except in modern Hebrew. There's a Milchemet Mitzvah, but there's no Milchama Kedosha. Therefore, it has to have a chance of success. Finally, war must be conducted only against hostile forces, not against civilian populations. Therefore, there must be avenues of escape for non-combatants, on condition that they are really non-combatants, not a protection for a future war. There's also no unnecessary killing of the enemy, and no spoiling of fallen combatants or outrages against prisoners of war. We also prohibit any wanton destruction of the environment. Only destruction that advances and hastens victory can be continence. Thus, the primacy of military targets. And of course, primacy is not exclusive. Military exemptions are based upon economic, family, and psycho-moral or physical handicaps. The war, therefore, must command the assent of enough of the mobilized population to prevent impairment of the mobilization efforts by the opposition activating their exemptions, which we're going to go through in more detail today. 2 criteria of normal discussion of just war, proportionality, and last resort are not mentioned in Judaism because nobody knows how to assess what is proportionality, and no human being knows what a last resort is. There can always be another resort. Therefore, criterion which are not subject to human judgment are excluded. Okay, now I want you to look at some of the sources we went through. So the Hebrew sources, and some of them translated into English. The first is on the list of sources. Okay, wonderful. The first comes in Deuteronomy 20:19. Ki tatsur al ir yamim rabim lachim aleh letafsa. Lo tashchit et etza lindoach alav garzen. Ki mimena tochal voto lo tichrot. Ki adam eis hasadeh lavo mipanech b'matzor. This summary of 2019 about sieges and the prohibition of destroying trees. And the last one is remarkable line, Ki hadam eitz hasadeh lavo mipanecha b'matzor, was interpreted to mean that if a tree could flee from you, would not destroy it. Therefore, if a human being were to flee from you and no longer present a threat, you're not allowed to destroy it. And I mentioned before that means fleeing without arms or fleeing without the ability to regroup. Now, this is explained in Sefer HaChinuch, Mitzvah 529, Shelo lashkit ilanei machal, and there he generalizes to the destruction of all wanton destruction. Okay? And the reason it mentions Eitz Machal, because that is subject to a specific punishment. But if you look at the last line, if one is involved in wanton destruction, then he also is subject to punishment by lashes. But the prohibition of all is quite remarkable here. It's not limited to the true. It became evident of Bao Tashchit, and therefore the line says, Ha ka'avar mishum Bao Tashchit. He prohibited from wanton destruction. Okay, I'm now going to the third source because we're going details on sources later on. There it specifically says, when you come close to approach a city to attack it, you shall offer terms of peace. Now, listen to the language. Vaya im shalom tancha ufatchalach vaya ko am hanibsaba yu lachala mas vavducha. So the verse is very clear. First, they have to respond peacefully. But verbal commitment is insufficient. They have to let you into the city. And the city has to agree to be subject to you. Now, if they do not make peace with you, meaning allow you into the city to show they have no goal of enmity or future war, then you then can lay siege to the city. My point is, the halacha requires action to back up verbal commitment. It is not enough what they say. Our question is what they do. Now look at Deuteronomy Rabbah 5:13. Amar Rabbi Yeshua de Sichni, b'shem Rabbi Levi. Kol ma shegazar Moshe hiskim hakadosh baruch hu imo. Remarkable statement. Those things decreed by Moses acquired God's consent. So we have things in the Torah which were initiated by Moses, but backed up by God. Look at the example. Hakadosh baruch hu amar lo shilachem im sichon. God told Moses to go fight and make war with Sichon, as it says in Devarim 2:24, Vidgar bo milchama. That is, initiate a war with them. And he did not do it. What did he do? He sent messengers for peace. Line 4. Amar kadosh baruch hu, kach amarti lachal lachem imo. Didn't I tell you to go fight with him? And you called out for peace, meaning if they make peace for you, you would not fight them. Now watch the next line. By your life, I'm going to fulfill your decree. And that's why the verse says, Kol milchama, sheyu lo yipotchim ela b'shalom. Kol milchama, all war, even a milchemet mitzvah, must be initiated by peace. Only when they refuse peace. Now, this is two remarkable things. One is the expansion of the rules of discretionary war and its ethical limitations to milchemet mitzvah. God commanded it. It was a milchemet mitzvah. Therefore, there was no reason or no need to initiate peace proceedings. Moses expanded upon God's claim, initiated a new restriction, and according to the Midrash, God accepted Moses' restriction and argued from now on, no war can be started without first offers of peace. So this is a remarkable source because it means the rulings that we have in the Torah, some of them are initiated by Moses and confirmed by God rather than initiated by God. It's theologically potency demands a whole discussion, but that's not what we're going to do. And I want to quote two medieval sources, the Abarbanel and the Ramban. The Abarbanel, okay, I'm looking for the line. There's much in the two I've already summarized already, but the Abarbanel emphasizes in line 4, you can see it in large print or bold print. He says, V'lo dai b'minei shalom levad. It's not enough that they talk about peace alone. Kigam shitzaref elav tanai sheni. And what is the second condition? Hu shetiftach daltei ha'ir, or shetipatach daltei ha'ir, shikansu Yisrael shama. the only offer of peace which is accepted if they open the city and allow Israel to move into the city. So a verbal commitment has to be backed up by action, and the Barbanot emphasizes. And therefore it goes to say, if they say shalom, but don't act accordingly, then you have a right to go out and fight them. Now look at the next source, very last line on that page. He quotes the Ramban, and he makes this idea, shetichlol hamilchamot kulam bein milchemet chova ubein milchemet reshut. Now sometimes what is called milchemet mitzvah, some people categorize as milchemet chova. Sometimes the two categories are overlapping. Sometimes there's a distinction made between the two. In any case, the Ramban uses the categories milchemet chova or milchemet reshut. And he makes one of the remarkable distinction, but expansion, that the limitations of discretionary war apply also to milchemet mitzvah. And repeat, milchemet mitzvah, people translate as a commanded war. And I think the better translation is when conducting the war, one is fulfilling a commandment, which is a lot different than saying you are commanded to do it. Okay, now let's go to the next source. Okay, now, Nachmanides also, as many other authorities, are very much concerned on the moral stature of the Jewish soldier. Normally, discussions of war, there's limitations maybe on the destruction of the enemy, but it's amazing how many sources from Nachmanides on almost through the 19th century, in fact, even 20th century sources, including a Rav Kook, were much concerned with the moral quality of the person who goes to war. So he said the following. I repeat line 3. Hayadua. We know that when people go out to war, what will they do? Yachlu kol toeva, yigzelu, v'yachsmesu, v'lo yitbosheshu, afilu ben if, v'chol nevala. In other words, there's no limit to what people do in war. Soldiers who are used to war will do almost anything. So he says very carefully, Vayashar b'nei Adam, even the most honest of people, b'tivo, yitrabesh achzariut, v'chema, ketzeit machane oyev. In order to go to war, it demands a certain degree of cruelty. And without that cruelty, it's very difficult to what? Win the war. Therefore, the Torah goes out of its way. Al kain, he's here, Bo'akatu. Scripture warns us, v'nishmarta mikol devara. Be careful of all wrongdoing, because the wrongdoing affects the character of the soldier. Now, this is extraordinarily important in a citizen army, because a citizen army is not professional. They're not in there for a lifetime. They get reintegrated back into society. A person who's been very cruel and killed people in justified causes could easily end up killing people in unjustified causes. Once a person has done a wrong, that wrong becomes easier to do the second time, even if the conditions have changed. So therefore, the akhzariyut, what we call the brutalization of the moral quality of the soldier, is one of the major reasons for the restrictions on destruction. Not only that the enemy suffers unnecessarily unwanted destruction, but the destruction of the moral quality of the soldier, which is just as important. Okay, now I'm going to come to what is extraordinarily remarkable. And in fact, I'm unaware of it existing in any other system of law, of exemptions, and why they play such a key role. Okay, so in Deuteronomy 20, verse 5 to 8, we have the following exemptions. First is, Aish asher bana bayit chadash. Person just built a home, v'lo chanachon, apparently did not dedicate it. We praise apparently where the expression Chanukah bayit comes from. and he not return, he's going to be worried that somebody else will dedicate his home. Or a person who just planted a vineyard. He also can return from the draft, lest he die, and somebody else take over his vineyard. Finally, a person who's engaged and not yet consummated the marriage, he also would go home, lest he die in war and somebody else take her. Then we have a fourth category, a little bit of distinction. So let's look at this and try to understand what's going on here. There are three categories that go together. Person who built a house, planted a vineyard, just got married. Now, when are these things most likely to take place? These are most likely to take place at an age in a man's life when he's a maximum of combat readiness. First builds a house, plants a vineyard, gets married. We're probably talking to a person from 18 to 25. Precisely the age you most want a person for a combat unit. You don't want somebody 55 in a combat unit. Now, why would there be exemptions for people who are most necessary in war? And then the fourth goes on to say, so a person is fearful, and there's a disagreement with Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Akiva what that means. What does it mean? Why is he arei and rach levav? Why do we have two categories? So one is rach levav, he's fearful of getting killed. And the other is he's fearful of killing. Both could exempt him. He's fearful of getting killed. Therefore, what he would do, he'll likely run. And when he runs away, other people follow him and could undermine the military effort. The other one is a person who has moral compunctions and will not kill. One is Yaharog, one is Shema Yehareg. He's also exempt. Now, why would anybody exempt these people, is my question asked before. Second, are they exempt in Milchemet Mitzvah or from Milchemet Reshut? And if they did, how would you possibly involve a draft if you exempted these people? After we know that Gidon, when he exempted people who were Rach Levav, he significantly reduced the number of soldiers. And if you had three more categories, you do it even more. Secondly, how would we ascertain whether these people built a Bayit Chadash or a new Kerem or just got engaged? If you think about it, the bureaucracy involved in ascertaining the validity of these is almost impossible. In other words, by the time you ascertain whether the man is this way or that way, the war could be over and you could have lost the war. So why would it be the case? So I have an opinion on the subject, is that the function of these three categories is to slow down the mobilization process for those who are reluctant to go to war. Now, who would be most reluctant to go to war? The person who's most reluctant to go to war would be the person who has most to lose. He's got a new home. He's got a new vineyard. He's got a new wife or about to be. Therefore, he'd be most reluctant to go to war, and he would do everything possible to get out of the war if he felt the war was unnecessary. But if he felt the war was necessary, meaning the enemy is on the border and they're already about to attack or already have attacked, then he has the most to lose. He would, of course, lose his home, lose his vineyard, and probably lose his wife. Therefore, in a necessary war, he would have the most to lose. Therefore, he's most likely to volunteer to fight in this war. Now, meaning the following. So we normally explain the mobilization process as called by the executive and approved by the Sanhedrin, Beit Din. But according to this, the final approval of going to war is with the citizenry themselves. You could have a war declared by the king or the executive, okayed by the representative body, and unable to mobilize the population because people are claiming their exemptions. Now, I got this idea from my father, who was a doctor, who told me that during the Second World War, people would come to him and say, Doc, please do not exempt me. Please do not find something wrong. I want to go fight and defend the country. And then I compared that experience with my own lifetime, since I was in college during the Vietnam War, and people I knew did everything possible to avoid the war. What was the distinction? I assume the distinction was the Second World War. We were under attack, and people felt the necessity to defend the country. Many people in the Vietnam War felt it was unnecessary, and they were risking their lives for a political position, but not for defense of America. My point is, you could have a president and a Senate, the equivalent agencies of government, approving the war and fail at mobilization because they've not convinced the people that it's worth their lives. Therefore, what I take the three is, these are three of the mobilization age, which could easily use exemptions or extend it through bureaucratic means and slow down the mobilization process. Therefore, it is obligatory upon those who call the war to convince the people that it's worth going to war. So therefore, I summarize in one line. If the people do not believe it's a necessary war, which means their own lives and interests are at stake, they're reluctant to go to war and try to activate exemptions and slow down the mobilization process. If people believe it is a necessary war and they can lose by not going to the war, they'd be the first to volunteer for the war and therefore would not what? Activate the exemptions. Okay, now who is exempt? So let's look at the final source from the Mishnah Torah of the Rambam. He says the following. I'll read the English, but you have the Hebrew there. He said the following rules apply when Gentiles lay siege to Jewish cities. If their intent was financial gain, which means they're just trying to make money off it, the Sabbath law should not be violated because of them, nor are we allowed to wage war against them. If a city is located near the border, however, follow closely distinction. We should march against them with weapons and wage wars against them, even if they're demanding hay or straw. The assumption is they're on our border and they are about to attack us. The demand of money is only a pretext. What they really want to do is destroy us. Now, it goes on. In any location, if the Gentiles' intent was Jewish lives, they're out to kill us, or if they engaged in battle with a city or laid siege to it without stating a specific intention, right? Once they've laid a city, we assume what? They're going to kill us. Therefore, we must wage war against them. And the Sabbath laws should be violated because of them. Now listen very closely. If it is a mitzvah for every member of the Jewish people who can come to their assistance to go out and aid their brethren who are under siege and save them from the Gentiles. I repeat in the Hebrew, mitzvah al kol Yisrael shecholim lavo v'letzeit v'lazor lachem shebamatzor latzilam miyad ovdei kochavim u'mazorot b'Shabbat. V'asur lehem litmameya l'motzei Shabbat. They're not even allowed to delay until Shabbat is over because lives are at stake. So the last line says in English, after they save their brethren, they may return home with their weapons on the Sabbath, so that a dangerous situation will not be created in the future. They will not have weapons. And if you don't let people return with their weapons, they may be reluctant to take their weapons. Therefore, life comes first. Now, I emphasize this because in modern Israel, there's a large number of people who seek exemption from army, and they quote Maimonides in Hilchot Shemitah and Yovel, 13:12, where there Maimonides says that the Levites are exempt from military exemption. There are people in the modern state of Israel who have exploited the situation and argue that those who are full-time study of Torah are like the Levites and therefore exempt. Now, the Rambam's position in Hilchot Shemitah and Yovel, as far as I know, nobody has found a rabbinic source for this, and nobody exactly knows why the Rambam says that. But in any case, he limits it to Levites, and apparently limiting it to Levites means only Levites when the Beit HaMikdash is Kayam, because they have to work in the temple. Otherwise, it would not be exempt. In any case, in the source right in front of you, he says very clearly, it is a mitzvah for every member of the Jewish people who can come to their assistance. So if the Jewish people are under attack nobody can claim exemption on Torah grounds of learning. There are only 3 exemptions I mentioned above, and we went through them already. Okay, now our last category is the following source. Why can a person not easily go to war if his life is at stake? Now, there's no shortage of sources which argue that an individual is part of the community, like a limb is part of the body, and therefore every limb is obliged to protect the body. There are comments like this found in Yehuda Levi's Kuzari and also in the Rambam, meaning the survival of the community exceeds in importance the survival of the individual. On the other hand, a person should be very careful not to volunteer for a war that he thinks is unnecessary, meaning he has no right to risk his life unless his life is at risk. Now, I emphasize this because it's not easy to explain why Jews should be required to go to war in a Jewish war, and most of them use the model of self-defense. So they say, if somebody's out to kill you, hashkem fargehu, which means beat him to the punch and kill him first. Now the question is, can the domestic situation or analogy be extrapolated to the national situation? So if somebody comes to kill me, I can kill him. Either I can kill him to protect my life, or I can kill him to prevent him from becoming a murderer. Now the question is, does that apply to a warlike situation? In a war, you frequently kill people who are not specifically aimed to kill you. Secondly, in a war situation, your life is not always in danger. So the argument is, can we extrapolate from the individual situation of self-defense to the national situation of self-defense? So I'm going to quote the following source. This is a very strange source. It's well known, but explains why a person who sells himself into slavery, probably due to overwhelming debt or having stolen, and he's an indentured servant and has to work off his debt, but he cannot work off his debt more than 6 years. That's the limitation. What happens after 6 years? He decides he wants to remain a slave. He prefers the security of getting meals every day than joining a labor market in which he can't get a job. So between security and freedom, the person chooses security. To which the Tosefta asks the following question. When he chooses security, they bore a hole in his ear next to the doorpost. So the Talmud asks, or the Tosefta asks, Manishtana, Ozen, Yoter, Lertzo Mikoy Varav. Why did they bore the hole in the ear as opposed to someplace else? And the answer they give is, Lefi Sheshama Mihar Sinai, Ki Li B'nei Yisrael Avadim, Avdaihem, because that ear heard at Mount Sinai that the Jewish people are Avadim, servants of God. They are my servants. And what did this man do? He voluntarily chose servitude. And choosing servitude, he's exempt from many mitzvot. So the line goes on to say, Uparak mimeno ol shamayim, v'mlich alav ol basar v'dam. He threw off the yoke of God and imposed upon himself the yoke of man. Mafikach. Therefore, the verse says, Amar Katuv, Tavo ozen v'tiratza. Let the ear come and be bored. Why? Shelo shamra et masha shama. Because the ear did not hear what God said at Sinai. Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim. I liberated them from Egypt in order they should be my slaves, not the slaves of others. They are subject to my will, not to the will of others. And this person voluntarily rejected freedom, chose slavery, therefore he's a marked man. Now, the point of this means that we are not allowed to fritter away our lives unnecessarily. Accordingly, when we are called up to war, the population has to be convinced of the validity of the war. Now, part of this is what is called military morale. When people fight for a cause they believe is justified, which is almost frequently a defensive war, they fight with a different gusto than offensive wars. This is known throughout. You can see the situation in Ukraine and Russia. You can see the situation, of course, in Israel and Gaza. Meaning, as Ben Gurion said, 2/3 of military effort is popular morale. When people are convinced of the validity of the war, they risk themselves. And when they're not convinced of the validity of the war, they leave or do not endanger themselves. So this idea, we do not fritter away our lives for unnecessary means. But if it's a real war and declared, and we are convinced of its necessity, then we participate because of the belief that the human being or the individual is like the limb of the body, obliged to protect the body insofar as the body is under threat, because when the body is under threat, the limb is under threat. Therefore, we have in modern warfare, based upon Judaism here, not only can a war be authorized by the executive, supported by the Sanhedrin or the representative body, but the government apparently has an obligation to convince its citizenry to join the war effort in the belief that they are maximizing the good, minimizing the evil, and were they not go to war, greater destruction would take place than by going to war. That's why I mentioned the 3 exemptions, because the 3 exemptions are composed of people who, if the war is unnecessary, would be reluctant to go and therefore activate their exemptions. On the other hand, if the war is necessary because we're under attack, they have most to lose, and therefore we join the war most enthusiastically. For example, in my own situation, I have a cousin of mine living in southern Israel who's now about 40 years old, has 6 children. He was called up. He could have activated his exemption because he has 6 children. That's the rule there. He refused to activate his exemption because he knew that his unit would be under threat of war. And if they're under threat of death, he has to be there. Meaning in a situation of high morale, people volunteer. Not only they volunteer for dangerous situations. And therefore their effectiveness far exceeds the army, which is coerced into war, as those who believe in the necessity of war. Okay, we're summarizing understanding of war. In addition to what we said last time, we want to allow for more times for questions here on the conduct of the war, on the means of activating the war, the means of approval, and the limitations of war, and the imposition in Judaism and among the Rishonim of the limitations of discretionary war get applied also to mandatory war, which means there really is no war in Judaism, which is bereft of ethical considerations.
Okay, we will open to questions. You can put questions into the chat, and I see we have a couple. As long as it doesn't get out of hand, we can also try to allow people to unmute and speak a question, maybe put in the chat that you'd like to do so. And I'll do my best to curate some of these questions and bring them to Rabbi Professor Kimelman. Marshall Porter writes, what are the limitations about desecrating Shabbat when we have a mitzvah? You gave the example in the Mishnah Torah, Shabbat 2:23, about taking your weapons home on Shabbat. We have similar halacha where if you need to get to the hospital on Shabbat or possibly save a life, you can shut off your car if you are afraid that it would be stolen, and that would in the future make you not go to the hospital to save a life. Are there other similar situations that have a similar form of argument that would permit you to break the sanctity of Shabbat for some other reasons?
No, not for some other reason, but when life is endangered. And we're quite liberal when life is endangered. So there are even those who rule, for example, that you can take the car to the hospital, and they even rule that you can go back from the hospital in the car for fear that you may be reluctant to go initially if you can't come back and have to walk through dangerous neighborhoods. In fact, there's a very famous story told about Reb Chaim, a brisk, that a person got sick and he told him to rush to the hospital. And somebody asked him, I was on Shabbat, and somebody asked him why he was mekel, lenient with regard to the laws of Shabbat. And he said, that's not the issue. I am machmir with regard to the nefashot.
As I recall, there's a beautiful line in Shulchan Aruch talking about, in general, violating the Shabbat for someone who might have a medical danger, where the Shulchan Aruch says, "V'hazariz hareze meshubach." Anyone who's quick to do so, all the better. V'hashoel harehu keshofech damim. And one who asks the question, that person is as if they're spilling blood.
Because you're taking extra time. You see that? But the primacy of life, and that all can be sacrificed to maintain life on the assumption what? We're maintaining life, not that you stubbed your toe.
Exactly. So Rabbi Avis Miller asks a fascinating question. Is there a line to be drawn between enemies who are Ovdei Kochavim and followers of monotheistic religions?
I don't know if that applies to war, though it applies to other categories, as we all know. But in one sense, people are judged by their behavior, not by their beliefs. Regard to war, I'm talking about. If a person who is a threat to you, then we don't distinguish whether he believes or not believe in God. In other issues, we know that's that becomes a major issue. But I'm not aware of anybody who makes such a distinction with regard to defensive war. And apparently means, well, you're judged by your deeds, not by your beliefs, if you threaten our lives. If somebody knows of a source where someone makes a distinction, if somebody's out to kill you, whether we care whether he's a believer in God or not, in fact, I would argue that you only know a person whether he believes in God is by his behavior. It's not a question of what he says. And if his behavior is cruel and dastardly, then he's ovei kochavim mazarot, no matter what he affirms verbally. But that's my own opinion.
Thank you for sharing that, and thank you to Avis Miller for that very interesting question. If I may get on a soapbox that Rabbi Kimelman was on and expand a little bit, talking about exemptions. One of the, I guess, controversy in Israel that goes on has to do with women participating in military service. And I wanted to bring up the Mishnah and ask Rabbi Kimelman if you would care to comment on it. The Mishnah in Sota 8:7, which I'm going to put in to the chat, which talks about, after talking about the exemptions from war that you taught about, and says, when does this apply? Only in Milchemet Reshut, only in permissive wars. But for Milchemet Mitzvah, even the bride and groom from their chuppah, so to speak, have to go to war. So I'd be interested in your comments on that. In particular, I believe other ancient thoughts would rather be defeated in war than to suffer the indignity of women participating in war. So I'd invite your thoughts on that Mishnah and its application, and perhaps some comparison to other practices.
That is a source most oft-cited to remove any religious exemptions from participating in war. It's interesting, if you look at almost all the authorities who wrote about war in the 1950s, Israeli authorities who were subject to it, almost none of them have a blanket exemption for the study of Torah. This phenomenon started becoming popular in the 60s and grew as a party representing such a group, almost as if they made an agreement. We will get you out of war and you will vote for us. Since that was not the position of any political party, and the constituency was very small, so therefore the Rambam began to be quoted quite late, not quite early. And there are those who quote the source, which I said in Hilchot Shemitah V'Yovel, and those who quote the one here. Now the other sources is, while women apparently may participate, there are others who say they're not required to participate. and is based upon the rules of Pidyon Shvuim, that we redeem a woman before a man, because the indignities to a woman exceed the indignities to a man, which means that potential indignity plays a role in what comes first. Remarkable. But anyhow, that's those who believe that there is no exemption based upon religious grounds of study of Torah or any other function, quote the source consistently. Those who say there is an exemption quote the source and argue that people in the full-time study of Torah are like the Levites. And to this degree, that it remains to disagree, and it's a pity much of this agreement breaks down on political grounds in Israel, on political parties in Israel. That's a present reality.
Rabbi Leonard Levy asks, in a Milchemet Reshut, a permissive war, may a recently betrothed man elect to ignore his exemption and go to war, or is he required to go home?
Yeah, that issue is not resolvable. There are people who argue both sides of the fence here. In any case, the word Milchemet Reshut, I would emphasize, is, I think, better translated as an authorized by the court, Reshut Beit Din, as opposed to using the phrase an optional war, which is a whole different way of understanding it. We're talking about what authorizes war. So in halachic categories, you ask not in thought, but how is it done? What would make it a mitzvah? What would make it a reshut? Okay, and if you said it's optional, who decides where it's optional? So even if you claim the word optional, you need a body or authoritative body to declare it optional, which goes back to Reshut Beit Din. Okay, but there's an argument of whether the exemptions are required or may be done, because the only explanation is in the fourth one, for fear that upon running away, he will cause havoc and others will follow. So you don't want him there because it undermined the military effort. Others say that if a person just got engaged or just built a house, his mind would be focused on his loss and therefore could not focus attention to the military effort. And having soldiers which are not totally committed to the military effort is counterproductive. So they're arguing not so much from the person of the individual, but a person like this who participates in the war is a negative factor, not a positive factor. Therefore, you're better off with fewer people totally committed than more people half committed, because at times of havoc, they will run away first. But that's a fascinating disagreement. I'm not aware of a consensus on that issue.
Imagine a lack of consensus. The next question, the person asks, Israel is a democratic country. Moral or support for winning against Hamas is strong. Some are protesting against it because the hostages are not out yet. What are your thoughts about this situation?
I wasn't really the topic for today, but since you foisted upon me, what's amazing is the number of soldiers in Gaza who have protested lest the government slow down the military effort. Also, what's interesting is the number of people who will not allow trucks to bring food into Gaza until they release the hostages. On the hostages, there are two positions on the subject in the Israeli population. One is, we are willing to risk or sacrifice a bit of the military effort to bring the hostages back home. And others say, if you do that, you risk more soldiers getting killed. And therefore, what benefit do you have if you release a hostage and soldiers get killed in the passage? Each person is worth the whole world. So within the two positions. But amazing is, after a war for 3 months, the amount of opposition to the war is quite minimal, especially among people who are subject to the draft. That's what's remarkable. I mean, just think of the war in Vietnam here, or subsequent wars. In fact, I was recently reading an interview by a Vietnamese general, and the person asked him, since Americans outgunned you and outmanned you, how come you won the war? And he answered the following way. He says, the American goes into the war, signs up for 2.5 years. He has 1 year of combat experience. 3 years he learns how to do it. 6 months he fights, and the last 3 months he's worried of keeping his life, himself alive, and wants to run away. Well, our soldiers are full time. So that tells you to what degree morale. At the moment, as far as I know, people could pitch in here. The morale of the Israeli soldier in fighting, I have relatives of mine, extraordinarily high. They want to complete the war. They think they're in the midst of it. And any slowing down the process, even if it releases some hostages, could also end up threatening the lives of more soldiers. And since every life is worth a whole world, we are in no position to say one life, ein dochi nefesh mipei nefesh, is more valuable than another life. Therefore, I think, this is my own opinion, we should leave it up to the military and political discretion to maximize the war effort and bring them close as possible. The last thing you want to do, like in the Gilad Shalit place, is release 1,000 people, including now the head of Hamas, causing the murder of over 1,000 Israelis, because we released what? One Israeli. So the purpose is not to get sentimental. We have to ask ourselves, what is best for the most people in the population? How do you maintain the war effort? And how do we prevent this from ever happening again? That's my own opinion. Okay, any other questions? I'm going to bring up one last issue, though. You know, we have time?
All right.
This is only because recently people have brought up the category of Amalek. Is the category of Amalek relevant here? So I said to you two things. One is, some people say Amalek is not a relevant category because the nations of Canaan have lost their national identity and no longer can be identified as anybody being a descendant of Amalek, just like you can't be a descendant of Canaanites. And those who claim there are descendants of Amalek, they never tell you whether patrilineal or matrilineal. And of course, how could anybody trace that? We don't have the DNA. But I think what's more important is actually looking at the verse in Exodus. It's a remarkable thing here. We all know the story. We say it very often. But in verse 14 of chapter 17 of Exodus, it says, "Vayomer Hashem Moshe, Ktov zot b'zikaron b'sefer, v'sim baznei Yoshua, ki mocho emche zechar Amalek mitachat hashamayim." So God says to Moses, write this on a document. A sefer is a document, like Sefer Kritut, and then put it in the ears of Joshua, that I, meaning God, will wipe out Amalek from under heaven. There are three questions here. Number one, why put in the ears of Joshua? Why not say the whole people? Two, who's taking responsibility to wipe out Amalek? God. It doesn't say Timche, here it says Macho Emche. Now I ask you, if God wiped out the Egyptians in 1 year through 12 plagues, how long would it take him to wipe out Amalek? So look at the next line, the last line. It says, "Vayomer ki yad al kes ya milchama Hashem ba'Amalek midor vador." What does it mean? How can God have a war with Amalek from generation to generation? He wiped out the Egyptians, 10 plagues, 11 months. Why can't he wipe out Amalek immediately? So remarkable here is, and I think this is, most people take this in subsequent literature as metaphor. So when they say the phrase ki yad al kes ya, the Midrash and subsequent commentators argue that the word case is abbreviated or truncated, and the Yud Hey is truncated, and therefore they say kol zman she'Amalek ba'olam ein kisei shalem. God's authority and throne is not complete, nor is God's name complete. Yeah. Avad zaro she'Amalek mi'olam, were they to disappear, then God's authority and his name would be filled. Now, it seems to me that that allegorical interpretation is actually the Peshat of the verse. Otherwise, you can't explain why God says, I will wipe them out, and why will it take from generation to generation? So, the Midrashic explanation that Amalek stands for human evil, and the ultimate victory over human evil can only be brought by the divine, as opposed to a specific evil, means that Amalek already in the Torah is metaphorical and not real. Meaning, we're not out to destroy a people called Amalek. We are to destroy the qualities of Amalek. The ability to pull that off is finally a divine move, not a human move, and therefore the war with Amalek will go throughout the generations until that is resolved in the Messianic era. if that explanation is correct, and the reason most people do not take that explanation to be correct is most people in day schools learn the story of Shaul and Amalek, and they read the Torah portion through the eyes of the Saul-Samuel conflict. And even though it says Divrei Torah midivrei Kabbalah lo yafinen, which means we do not derive Torah prohibitions from things written in the writings, Tuvim. In this case, many people read the rules of Amalek through Samuel's interpretation, as opposed to what I think is the literal interpretation, that it meant to be metaphorical, and thus it says, Joshua, you thought you started the war, you thought you were supposed to complete the war. That would be true if it were a real war against real human beings, but since it's a war against evil, then only as long as Zarosh Amalek Bolam, Ein Hashem Shalem, V'lo Kisei Shalem. And if that's true, it's a war that ultimately God will prevail, not humanity. And therefore, it seems to me that Amalek should be removed from the agenda. One final comment. People say that he's as bad as Amalek, and they talk about the Nazis or Hamas. If you look at the story in the Bible, Amalek was nowhere near the evil of Hamas and nowhere near the evil of the Nazis. Therefore, to call Nazis Amalek is what you're doing is downgrading their evil. The point of using that is to impress about how bad they are, but all you're really showing is how bad the Nazis were not. Therefore, we should be careful in use of the phrase and not splatter it around and apply it to all types of people, which is totally inappropriate. Again, my own opinion.
We appreciate hearing your opinions and your thoughts and your teaching over these past two sessions. And we want to thank everyone who participated and everyone for all of the fascinating questions that helped flesh out everything that we have been learning together. I'm again putting the names of the sponsors in the chat to thank them for their support. I also invite everyone, if you are not already part of the UTJ email list, please join, and I'm going to put a link to that, as well as a link to providing feedback toward this session. When we send out video of this program, you will also get the link to the feedback link as well as a copy of the sources from today. Again, thank you to Rabbi Kimelman for everything involved in this presentation. Thank you to the JCC on the Palisades for joining us and co-sponsoring this. And thank you to everyone who participated, sponsored, donated, etc., to make this program possible. With that, I bid everyone a good night.